Trigger warning, this podcast episode contains discussions of emotional and narcissistic abuse. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Emotional Abuse is Real. I'm your host, Serene Leeds, and I'm so glad you're here. I really mean that. The world is an absolute mess right now, and I would completely understand if you weren't in the mood to listen to a podcast about emotional and narcissistic abuse. So if you're still here and listening, thank you so much. So shifting gears, here is my weekly reminder that emotional abuse is real, still needs your support. And there are several ways you can do that. First of all, if you're a listener and you'd like to share your story, please don't hesitate to reach out via Instagram at Serene Leeds Writes. That's SarenLeedsWrites. You can also reach out via our Emotional Abuse is Real Facebook page or via email at hello@sereneleadswrites.com. A reminder that anonymous guests are always welcome. Another way you can support Emotional Abuse is Real is by heading over to Apple Podcasts and both leaving a rating and writing a review. The more reviews we get, the easier it is for people to find this podcast. Finally, you can support the podcast by following me on Instagram at Serene Leeds Writes and following our Facebook page, Emotional Abuse is Real. And if you are able, please consider donating to our Buy Me a Coffee page, which I've linked in the show notes. As I've said before, this is a one-woman operation, and your donations help fund the podcast's production costs. I'd also like to remind you about my free newsletter. This is a great opportunity to stay up to date on my latest published articles, as well as new podcast episodes. Also, it's a wonderful way to stay in touch with me directly, especially if you are a business or brand owner looking to punch up your website, email, or social media copy. I am available to work with you on any writing or editing you may need with your business and brand copy. Plus, as an added bonus, I send out a free delicious dessert recipe to every new subscriber. I've left the sign-up link in the show notes, and you can also subscribe directly via my website, sereneleadswrites.com. My guest for today's episode is Dr. Kerry McAvoy. Dr. McAvoy is a licensed psychologist as well as a narcissistic abuse survivor. She has channeled her experiences into a thriving career as an expert in toxic relationships through her book, Love You More, her podcast, Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse, and influential social media presence. I am honored to welcome Dr. McAvoy to Emotional Abuse is Real, and so appreciate her insights during our chat. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Kerry McAvoy.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm Dr. Kerry McAvoy. I'm a licensed psychologist with over 20 years of counseling experience, and I'm the author of Love You More, The Harrowing Tale of Lies, Sex Addiction, and Double Cross. And these days, I primarily promote narcissistic abuse awareness on various social platforms and have a podcast of my own called Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse.
Excellent. Then you're the perfect person to be on my podcast because this podcast is all about sharing stories and raising awareness about emotional and narcissistic abuse. So I am thrilled that you're here because not only are you a survivor of narcissistic abuse, but you have also channeled that experience into the work that you do now. And you're also a rare podcast guest in the sense that you're able to offer both a survivor's perspective as well as a clinician's perspective. So as you said, you have written a book about your experiences, but for those listeners who haven't read the book, can you please share what you can about your personal narcissistic abuse story?
Yeah, I think it's best if I start back that I was counseling. I had a private practice,
Hmm.
had a family, was married to a really decent man, had
Hmm.
3 growing sons, and then we lost him to cancer in
Hmm.
2015. So here I am
Okay.
in my early 50s and I'm widowed. And
Yeah.
I wasn't in the dating scene. I didn't really understand. I mean, I'd met him when I was 19, just
Sure.
freshly in college. So that was my whole adult experience. And I got into the dating
Yeah.
realm. And after a year of dating, I met somebody I thought was amazing, checked all the boxes, and
Hmm.
ended up in a marriage that I learned 2 months into it that it was basically not what I thought it was, that I had married a stranger. So the
Mm.
book describes this waking up to the reality of that something's incredibly wrong. Now, interestingly enough, when I wrote the story and I started it as the marriage was ending,
Hmm.
I didn't have the terminology for what I had survived. Interestingly enough, the field of mental health, of psychology, hasn't really focused a whole lot on relationship dynamics that happen with people who are very abusive or predatory. I mean, we look at
Hmm.
domestic violence, but we haven't really explored the impact of a relationship on a person who's relatively healthy functioning until they get into this relationship. So here I'm in this relationship. I know he has narcissistic traits. I mean,
Hmm.
I didn't diagnose him, but I recognize some of the traits.
Hmm.
Had no idea that there was this kind of almost like a syndrome happening, this way of which the relationship was unfolding. I thought it was something unique to us. So the book really describes that. It's written like a novel. It's written as if you're living the experience with me and
Wow. Okay.
going through it. And I know it's hard for people to read. For one, it can be quite triggering because it's very
Hmm.
graphic, but it
Yeah.
also um, I wrote it that way partly because I wanted people to know that I understood that any this can happen to anyone, that it
Hmm.
is not unique to people who are somehow more vulnerable in some way, that you can be somebody who has their life together and maybe even know a lot about relationships like myself and still get into an abusive relationship. Kind of surprisingly, it was very I was very taken back by what happened and trying to make sense of it.
Hmm.
So that's the book, is
Yeah.
the experience of what happened to me. Since then, I've I've learned a whole lot about the topic. Not, I mean, I always knew a lot about narcissistic personality disorder, but I've
Yeah.
since learned a lot about what happens in the dynamics of these very difficult, challenging relationships.
Yeah. I mean, the work that you do in the sense that you're directly focusing on narcissistic abuse is so important. It's why I started this podcast, because I still feel like these topics are not discussed enough, and they're also not understood enough. So that's why I look to get as many voices as I can on this podcast, to help raise awareness and to educate that this is a type of abuse that is out there, and it's like the title of my podcast says, it's very, very real.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really glad that you're here. So what would you say are some of the most conspicuous examples or symptoms that signify that someone is an emotional or narcissistic abuser?
I would say the love bombing is incredibly intoxicating and it's
Yeah.
very difficult to see through. You think you really met an incredible person. I mean, I actually, after the relationship was over, felt grief that
Hmm.
person didn't exist. I thought I'd met a real person.
Yeah.
Flawed, sure, he had some little bit of issues, but the person I ended up with was not the person I had met. And so
Mhm.
that makes it really hard, is how do you know that you're not meeting a real person? And even the idea, I'm autistic, so I'm kind of like,
Mhm.
what you see is what you get, very literal. The idea that you would present, not just put your best foot forward, everybody does that, but you would actually present a persona that you believe the other person wants to meet in order to get them into the relationship. I don't think every narcissist knows that it's a trap, but it ends up feeling like the one who meets this individual, they feel conned, they feel duped. So it's really hard to identify something that's too good to be true. I guess that's my
Mhm.
first warning, is watch out for that. If you're feeling this person really ticks all the boxes, you might want to step back and think, why? Are you seeing the whole picture of this person? Are you getting to see what they're like with their coworkers? Or what are they like with their family members? Do they have long-term friends? I mean, I think that was one of the signs I missed early on, is this person didn't have a lot of extra relationships in his life. His life was really, really narrow and with few interests. And I should have seen that as a warning flag, because we're not talking about a 20-year-old. I'm talking about nearly a 50-year-old man whose interest was too narrow, too specific. And that should have been a red flag. This person is hyper focused on something and it's not really developed themselves in a lot of different directions. So I would say that's one warning to watch out for. I think another one is that their charm and charisma and all this flattery, though which is really feels great, but there's a piece of it that's a bit controlling, as if they want things to go their way, and they're kind of testing your compliance with that. I remember an early example was my first date with him, and he was out of state, so he had to fly in. So I knew it was going to be a day-long date, and we went out to the beach in the fall, and he wanted to carry everything down to the edge of the water and wouldn't let me help. And I thought, well, I've raised kids and had a family and I'm very capable. I can do this. But he insisted that he had to do that.
Yeah.
And yes, you can see that as, well, why would you not like that? Wouldn't anybody love chivalrous behavior? But the need of it, the insistence to the point of almost being rude around it, to me, I should have seen that as also, that's a little rigid. That person really has to have things their way. But it's these subtle things. Now, granted, I saw flexibility in other areas where I thought he was like very accommodating and very, relaxed with me. So it's easy to overlook these things as possible red flags. I think the thing that I would love to have people remember is that everybody puts off red flags when we're anxious. But if you stay, I think what I did was I moved too fast to trust. And if we stay a little bit, I hate the word guarded, but it really is the best word. If you stay a little bit like objective, observing, you can pick up that some things feel off, and then you can test them over time. Do they stay off over time? That controlling behavior, I could have seen it show up here and then there and then there and then there, but I didn't continue to watch for it. I excused it. And I think that's another kind of error that a lot of us make, is we excuse things because we often put ourselves in that place and then we give our explanation for that behavior instead of seeing that behavior for what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and also because we want the relationship to work, we want to be happy, and I feel like we tell ourselves, well, nobody's perfect, so let's just let that one slide. But it is so important to be mindful of these kinds of behaviors.
Yeah.
So
I got to interview Sandra Brown. She wrote the book Women Who Love Psychopaths. Amazing. I just love her work. Groundbreaking work, I feel, in this area. And in the interview, I got to ask her, what percentage of the world do you think is predatory? I'm not just talking dysfunctional. I'm talking predatory. People who are actually exploitive, manipulative. She said roughly 20%. She said, our problem is we don't educate people to watch for it.
Yeah. I believe that. I believe that. Like, how do you educate people so that they don't go through life frightened, but they're aware?
Right.
That's something that I'm dealing with my daughter right now. Like, how much information do I give her without making her feel frightened of the world?
Right.
So it's really
it's tricky, because even I've noticed, and I need to like ask the audience, the people who listen to whatever I say, I really need to ask them this, but I've noticed a trend, and I'd love to hear if you're noticing it too.
Sure.
Is that I noticed that a lot of them report that after they get out of these relationships, they're agoraphobic. They really struggle leaving the house. They struggle getting out. They struggle wanting to meet new people, that their world becomes increasingly small because they realize that a lot of us, me too, you get out of these relationships and you realize that's not my first toxic relationship. Oh, I've had friends like this, or my family's not very healthy, or you start to see that there's this pattern around you that you have acclimated to bad behavior. And so in order to heal, you kind of have to cleanse the board and start over. But that can leave you, like you just said with your daughter, that can leave you really scared to meet people, because part of what happens in these relationships, and this is what I certainly did, is I thought I was a great at identifying troubled behavior. I mean, good grief, I made a living at diagnosing people.
Yeah.
And yet I missed it with this person. So then I felt like I betrayed myself. So then I started to doubt my ability to see and spot problems. So then what you do is you just like don't trust anything about yourself. You just like stop altogether, which
Yes.
can make your world really small, because then you're not going to go out and take risks. Like my thought about your daughter is the thing we need to be teaching ourselves and our children is how to trust our own instincts. My instincts were going off right away.
Yes.
But I had learned to not pay attention to them. But how can we get better at those of us who've turned it down to turn it back up, but those of us who are learning to start to learning to that gut instinct?
So to answer your question, I actually have several pieces of that answer, because I actually just did a podcast interview with someone who absolutely became agoraphobic after her toxic relationships. And she went through a lot of therapy, and she's an advocate now. She's extremely passionate, but it's interesting that you asked me that question, because I was like, yes, someone on the podcast is coming up, and she absolutely felt that way. For me, the more I've learned about myself, and the more I think about my emotional abuser was actually my boss. And the more I think about the different friendships that I've had over the years, I'm not afraid of leaving the house, but I am afraid of meeting new people. I am afraid of making new friends. I actually wrote a whole article about that. I will leave a link in the show notes if anybody wants to read that.
I'd love to see that article.
And I'll send it to you, because what you said about trusting your own instincts, I really started to doubt myself, especially while I was in my own abusive situation. Because I didn't have the support. So it was in the workplace. I had the support of my husband, but I did not have the support of my coworkers. So I absolutely stopped trusting myself. And the only reason why I was able to get out of there is because I had a great therapist and my husband was supportive, and they helped me to realize that this was not a good situation, and that I should trust my instincts, and that I should get out. So that's the answer to your question about people wanting people after they end their relationships being afraid to put themselves out there. It, of course, as always, depends on the person, but yes, it certainly does happen with at least some people that I've seen.
Yeah, and you sharing that it was at a work situation. What's interesting is, okay, so I've had some of this experience in a organization, so I know what that feels like to be part of a system that's sick. But mine was most intensely in a romantic relationship. But what I've noticed is that when it occurs in a system like a family or work, or say it's like a neighborhood organization or something, when that starts to go wrong, and then you got the group dynamic, the pressure that comes in around that person who's been targeted as the victim. Yeah. Wow. That's super challenging. And
it really was. And I mean, I've talked about it on the podcast before, but there's been an interesting new wrinkle that's caused me to think about the whole experience. So my abuser was my boss at Rolling Stone magazine. He's not there anymore. I don't name him, but he was definitely middle management. However, the recent news about the things that Jan Wenner said in the New York Times about how Black and female artists just aren't as articulate and didn't contribute as much to the rock and roll music scene as his favorite artist, as we all know, is complete bullshit.
Man.
It really got me thinking about, okay, why was my boss able to treat me the way that he did? Because Jan Wenner created that kind of a toxic work environment. So my boss was given free rein to treat me, because I was a woman, as a second class citizen. So it's like a poison that just, these kinds of attitudes that just seep through every element and every nook and cranny of these workplaces. And there were many articles that have been written about Jan Wenner in recent days that call him narcissistic. And I absolutely agree with that assessment. My boss was a narcissist. That's what my therapist called him. So I consider him to be one.
Yeah.
And but the lack of support is something that I do talk about a lot on this podcast, because that was just as painful as the actual abuse, because no one wanted to get involved. And also, since this was, I left 9 years ago, because it wasn't a physical abuse situation, everyone just thought I should get over it. And that's why I wanted to create this podcast, because I never thought that was fair.
Right. And I think there's a couple other dynamics that happen in these relationships or in these environments, is that the person seems to hold the most power, everybody knows that they need to stay on this person's good side.
Yes.
And the rewards for staying on the person's good side usually are worth it enough. At least somehow we end up finding that their attention is highly gratifying. I don't understand why, because it's not like they're any more special than anyone else, but somehow whenever they turn that spotlight of their approval on us, we just sort of glow and we love it. We seek it out. And we also know at the same time, to be on the wrong side of that is really dangerous, because we see what's happening to that person and we don't want to be the scapegoat. So it ends up creating this very toxic setup that's extremely hard to break out. The victim basically is silenced from all directions because it's working against that individual. It's a horrific situation. And I know I'm glad you're talking about it, because I don't think we talk about it enough. We focus so much on the romantic relationship.
Sure.
And we also then don't talk enough about female narcissists who exist almost as readily as male narcissists do.
Absolutely.
So here's this whole class of men who are in a relationship with somebody who's going, so it's there's a lot of avenues and sides to this. I think it's an extremely complex problem. I think it's a crisis. Someone just told me that, I think it was Dr. Ramani is calling this a healthcare crisis that we have. And I agree, it is.
It really is, because for years I felt like I was screaming into a void, and I was just like, no, this is a real problem. And no one wanted to talk about it because, for whatever reason, if they were afraid, they didn't some people just didn't think this was a big deal. I'm like, oh, well, you're fine. You're not being physically harmed. It wasn't sexual abuse. So what's the big deal? So you just learn to live with it. And, when I had my therapist say, I think you need to be on medication, and when she was saying, this is an untenable situation for you, that was when I knew that it was time to leave. I mean, because of the boys club element as well, I could, my career was completely stagnant. It flourished the second I left.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, I'm finding by doing this podcast that, of course, a lot of people are coming on and talking about romantic relationships, and I totally get that. But I'm usually talking about a workplace situation, because I've been fortunate enough where I have not had an emotionally abusive romantic relationship, but a lot of people also come on because they talk about their parents and how they treated them. And because earlier generations just they don't have the emotional capacity to support their children the way that they need to be supportive. And we don't blame our parents. I certainly don't. But I've had several guests come on and they talk about their relationships with their parents at length. And it's been such an eye-opener for me and for everybody. So, and I appreciate you letting me know that the workplace element does need to be discussed more.
It does. I mean, the research coming out about what happens in these relationships, because I've actually had this debate with another psychologist, because the DSM 5 doesn't really identify. It's not narcissistic abuse is not in it at all.
Right.
And we don't even recognize the fact that somebody can be traumatized by a relationship. If you look at the PTSD definition, it doesn't really. It says life dangerous, kind of life altering, dangerous situations. Well, you could look at these relationships and say, well, you weren't going to die there. I mean, that work wasn't, maybe ultimately is going to create health problems that would have had shortened your life, but you weren't imminently facing the threat of death at that job, I didn't realize I was facing the threat of death in the middle of the relationship, but my ex was probably attempting something to harm me on purpose. So, but I didn't know it at the time. So that doesn't qualify as a PTSD event, but it should, because they're finding that the survivors of narcissistic abuse rate of trauma is higher than the general public's response just to a very dramatic situation. I mean, if you and I went through an airplane crash, 40% of the people who survive that will struggle with PTSD, 60% will go on and do just fine. But yet those who come out of a narcissistically abusive relationship, 75% struggle with trauma symptoms.
Wow.
So why is the difference? I think the difference is because what happens in these relationships are so profoundly intimate in the way that they erode our sense of self and our value and our belief in ourselves, that they destroy our sense of trust in ourselves, of even us feeling we know ourselves. We become unrecognizable the longer we're in the relationship. That does profound damage. I know victims often say, I just wish they would have hit me. It would have been simpler. It would have been cleaner. I would have understood what I was in the relation, what was going wrong here. But I think it's all the subtleties that makes this so extremely damaging to the person's psyche.
Yeah. And I can give you plenty of examples of little things that trigger me, and everyone, my loved ones, are like, why are you letting that bother you? Like, an example I always give is, this is back during like the 2016 debates, when Donald Trump would just go wrong. That's what my boss would do to me. That's what my boss would do to me. And I'd be like, oh my God, I can't hear this. Like, when I would hear my boss's ringtone from his like archaic flip phone, I would get into a panic, and no one would understand that because it was so embedded. The experience was so embedded because I couldn't get away from him. Yeah. And it's just, so I appreciate that you pointed that fact out, because we really do suffer from a significant amount of trauma. So what I'd love to know is, like, I know you mentioned your podcast. So what specifically are you doing to help raise awareness about narcissistic abuse? Is it mainly social media based, or is it something that you're doing in your practice?
Well, I closed my practice when my late husband passed away.
Okay.
So I've not, and then when I got into that relationship, I actually moved internationally, and then I came back to the United States for other reasons, but it just wasn't going to work to me open a practice here where I'm living now. So, and at this point, I don't have a desire to go back to that. So these days, I primarily write, promote awareness, and all of it is through social media, which is where I spend most of my time. So I have a YouTube channel. I'm on Instagram, TikTok. Right now, I'm battling with Facebook to get my Facebook account back. It's been stolen and hacked. But hopefully it's still growing. It's so ironic. I can't access, and I'm watching it grow. It's like, that's so frustrating.
Oh God, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I have my own issues with Facebook, because there's a page for this podcast, but all it is I get the same spam messages of the people saying, yes, I was in an emotionally abusive relationship, but I found a hacker and he can help me. I get that all the time.
Yeah, you have to put a filter on those comments to filter them out. It's a hassle though, because they get really good at bypassing filters.
Yeah.
But so that's what I do primarily these days. My biggest focus at this moment is the podcast, Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse. That's really my baby. I now have a co-host, and we've just been, working very hard at that. And And we just started a Substack newsletter so that we're putting out blog articles now on a weekly basis in addition to that.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah. It sounds like you and I are doing a lot of the same things. I've got this podcast. I have a newsletter as well. So that's wonderful. So can you give me the handles so everyone can come find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Kerry McAvoy, PhD. It's the same everywhere. Kerry McAvoy, PhD. And if you want to find the podcast, it's Breaking Free from Narc Abuse is how you find it on social media.
Okay, no problem. Wonderful. Well, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you today. I can't thank you enough. And yeah, everybody go listen. Hey, listen to my podcast and go listen to Dr. McAvoy's podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. I really deeply appreciate it.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for listening to my conversation with Dr. Kerry McAvoy on Emotional Abuse is Real. If you would like to connect with Dr. McAvoy or check out her podcast, Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse, I've left links in the show notes. If you would like to share your own emotional abuse story here on the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out at hello@sereneleadsrights.com via our Facebook page, Emotional Abuse is Real, or through Instagram at Serene Leads Rights. Please note that this podcast should not be used as a substitute for professional mental health services. If you are a victim of emotional abuse and need help, please call or text the Suicide and Crisis Hotline at 988 or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START, START, to 88788. Once again, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Follow me on Instagram and on Facebook. Sign up for my free newsletter. And if you can, please support us through our Buy Me a Coffee page. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.